And good morning, everybody. It's good to see you streaming live out of Willow Springs, North Carolina. Hope everybody's doing well out there in the studio audience. Good morning, Nicole. Good morning, Ashley. Rasha, I would love to talk to you after class. If you want, we can either jump in a Teams meeting or we can do texts or phone calls. You let me know in the chat bar what you want to do, Rasha. I'll be more than happy to talk to you. Good morning, Erica. And good morning to you too, Eli. Great to see you. Sarah, good to see you. Thanks for showing up. And Imani, always here under her alias SRSTV. Melody Webb, fantastic. Good to see you too. Hey, folks, a friend of mine named Tori Rhodey might be here today. I hope she's in the studio audience. If you're out there in the studio audience today, Tori, good morning to you. If you want to log into Google, you can type into the chat bar as well, Tori. But if not, thanks for stopping by anyhow. Good morning, Amy. All right. Now, go ahead and start talking about chapter 6. If you remember on Tuesday, I introduced the idea of learning as a relatively permanent change uh, in behavior that results as a results as a result of environmental experience. And then I went through and I kind of explained to you how classical conditioning worked. Today, we're going to continue on in that theme. We're going to talk a little bit more about behaviorism. I'm going to review the behaviors principles, and then I'm going to introduce you to the second major mechanism by which humans and animals are supposed to learn operant conditioning. We're going to talk a little bit about shaping as a tool to create complex behaviors. And then hopefully I'll have a moment to talk to you a little bit about the limits of behaviorism. So let's go ahead and get started, shall we? Hey, Tori's in the house. Good morning to you, Tori. Glad you could make it. Okay, now let's go back and talk about these fundamentalist, fundamental behaviors principles. If you'll remember from Tuesday when I talked to you, I suggested that behaviorists had a specific idea about how behavior was acquired, how culture worked, why we did the things that we did. If we characterize those, we could probably characterize those behaviors viewpoints in two quotes that I put over here by John Watson. I'm not going to read them, but I want you to go ahead and look at them as I talk a little bit. Number one in the behavioralist tradition, environment is king. In the early days of the nature versus nurture debate, there were two big camps: the eugenists who believed that we were all born either of good quality or of poor quality. And then there were John Watson and his behaviorists who thought that the environment was really the most important thing. You know, I'm going to go ahead and put this out there while I'm talking. Which do you folks think is more important in developing human behavior, environment or genes? Go ahead and type in the chat bar. I'd be curious to hear your opinion. Now, not only did behaviors believe that the environment was king, they were anti mentalistic. We've had this theme that I've mentioned several times through the class. The thing that makes psychology scientific is they rely on measurement and observation. And behaviorists believe that you couldn't really measure the mind. Remember, I told you that was a big problem that had plagued psychology in the 19th century. And the behaviorists were anti mentalistic. They said you can't measure the mind. And even if you did, these folks said that it really didn't matter anyway. So we've got one environment, one genes. Anna says environment's more important than genes. That's interesting. Environment more, but both influence, both equally important. I think it's both, but varies based on the individual. Nice. We have a lot of environmentalists out here. If you take my developmental psychology class, you're going to come out of that class being convinced that maybe it's a little more genes than it is environment. But we'll talk about that in developmental psychology class. So the behaviorists believe that environment is king. And they really didn't think that the mind was something we should measure. We should instead measure environment and we should measure its effect on behavior. Those were sort of their two beliefs. Now, they had two models of learning. If you remember, on Tuesday, we talked about classical conditioning, which is learning by association. I suggested to you that we could attach environmental cues to reflex responses to create new, if you will, learned reflexes. So, salivation, being afraid, startling, these are all reflex responses. And we can learn to associate neutral stimuluses with these reflexes responses. I see Sandra McCauley's in here a couple of minutes late. Don't you worry, we're glad to have you tonight. All right, now let's talk a little bit about operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a different model. This is what we would call learning by consequences, whereas your classical conditioning learning, in classical conditioning, the learner didn't have to do anything. The dog was just sitting there. In operant conditioning, championed by this guy right below me, B.F. Skinner, what he suggested is that we have active learners who engage in random behavior that incrementally becomes non-random based on consequences. So a learner engages in some behaviors, we pick the behavior we want, we reinforce or reward that behavior, and then that behavior quits becoming random and it becomes intentional. So, how many of you have a dog that you've taught a trick? If you would, go ahead and type in the chat bar and let me know. Have you had a pet, a dog, or a cat, if you can train a cat? And have you ever trained that animal to do something? What have you trained them to do? Okay. Oh, listen to Brian Wilson. Very interesting. He takes the biblical take on the nature versus nurture method. You know, actually, Brian, that's quite insightful and clever in this particular situation. Uh, nice, very nice. I typically don't reinforce the non-scientific religious quotes in a science class, but you're onto something there. Very, very interesting. All right, so in this particular thing, Nicole trained her dog. Nicole thinks her dog's trained her. That's funny. Very good. Cole's sister taught his dog to sit on his back legs. Nice. That's kind of cool. Jumps up and gives you kisses when you pat your chest. Okay. Ooh, Anna can do the high five. Nice. And waiting for permission. You know, dogs do need to be trained to wait, right? Okay, so in a sense, if any of you have trained an animal to do something, you have used operant conditioning. What you've done is you've been out there with that dog, you've had a reinforcer, some sort of treat that the dog likes, you've waited for the desirable behavior, and when that happens, you've reinforced the dog verbally, good dog, and you gave them a treat. In a sense, what you've done is you've used consequences to turn a random behavior into a non-random behavior. Okay, does that make sense? So, whereas in classical conditioning, the learner doesn't have to do anything, we do know that learners are exploratory creatures and we do things, and our behaviors are shaped by the consequences. Now, in the behaviorist model, in operant conditioning, we're going to talk about two kinds of consequences, and this is going to be important. This seems obvious earlier now, but when I talk about the difference between negative and positive reinforcers, you're going to get confused again. So stick this in your mind. Reinforcers are any consequences that make a behavior more likely in the future. Okay, so if you would type in the chat bar, what kind of reinforcer did you use to get your dog to high five you? Did you get to have your dog sit or obey commands? What treat did you give them? If you gave them something that they liked, that is a consequence that makes their behavior more likely in the future, right? Now, a punisher is any environmental consequence that makes a behavior, less likely in the future. I have a typo here, less likely in the future. A punisher is any consequence that makes a behavior less likely in the future. Okay, Anna cut treats and rewarded him with yes. There you go. You know what? Dogs like praise and love too. That is reinforcing. You know what? Human beings love praise and warm statements too. That's also reinforcing. Food is reinforcing, absolutely. Anything can be reinforcing. Head pats, great. Those are all reinforcers that make a behavior more likely. We're going to differentiate those from consequences, which make a behavior less likely. What's a way that you might stop your dog from doing something you don't like? How many of you trained a dog not to do something? Not to pee inside, not to jump up on people, not to do something. And how did you cause the dog to stop doing that? Okay, Anna F says she gets bopped gently if he does incorrect things. We don't say no, we don't say bad dog. There you go. She's going to be affirmational, but she does bump the dog. She gives the dog a little bit of negative consequences. Some people use a spray bottle when their dog is doing something they don't want, and you give the dog a little spray of water in their face, and they don't like that. And this is a consequence that's designed to make your behavior less likely. Now, how did B.F. Skinner study this? He studied mainly reinforcers, and he studied them using this thing he called an operant conditioning chamber. Now, this tool got so famous that it became known as a Skinner box. And you'll see the Skinner box over here on the far left. You see there's a rat in there. There's a lever that the rat can press. And if you'll notice that there is a bottle of food pellets outside of that cage, and there's a little food tray. And you can set it up, and B.F. Skinner would set it up so that that rat could press that bar and get a food pellet. Now, sometimes that rat could press the bar once and get a food pellet. Sometimes that rat had to press that bar 10 times to get a food pellet. But what B.F. Skinner showed was that if you do that, that rat will eventually start pressing that bar a lot. All right. Now, if you look beside the Skinner box, you see a cumulative recorder. And what he would do, this is kind of like that EKG paper they used to roll out back in the day. It sort of rolls, and you have a stylus, and the stylus is making a mark on that paper. And what he would do is he would set that stylus up so that every time the animal did the behavior, the stylus would tick up. And if the animal didn't do the behavior for a while, the stylus would drop back down. But as long as the animal kept ticking the behavior, doing the behavior, the stylus recording it would record the behavior. So let me show you this real quick. So basically it would look like this. This is frequency of lever presses. This is time, okay? And the stylus would start down here. And as the animal starts pressing the bar, the stylus would go up. And if the animal keeps pressing the bar, the stylus would stay up here like this. And if the animal stops pressing the bar, the stylus would go down again. Okay? And so what you could do is you could measure behavior acquisition, he called it. Okay? This is behavior acquisition, and this is behavior extinction. And what he found was that if you reinforce that bar press, the behavior would be acquired. And if you stopped reinforcing that behavior, that lever press, the animal would quit doing that behavior. Does that make sense to everybody? Does everybody understand how he would use the Skinner box and the cumulative recorder? And what he could do is he could measure very carefully how behavior was acquired, when it was acquired, and how quickly it was acquired. And then what he would do is he would vary the kinds of reinforcements that he gave the animal to see how quickly and efficiently the animal learned. One of the main things that he showed is that you do not need to reinforce a behavior every time for that behavior to be learned. Now, if you look over here, I've got two definitions here, continuous reinforcement and partial reinforcement. How many of you give your dog a treat every time they go out or they do the trick? Do you folks say good dog to your dog every time they do the treat? Or do you sometimes just let them do the trick and not reinforce them? What period of time is this over? Brian, you ask a great question. It would depend on how quickly the learning occurred. So let's say over a half an hour period, you could measure this behavior, Brian. So it would scroll out for a half an hour. And what you're going to find is if you put a rat in this cage, they're not going to press the bar immediately. They're instead going to explore their environment, and they're going to accidentally press that bar. And when they press that bar and the food pellet shows up, they're going to eat the food pellet. They'll continue to explore, but they're going to explore closer over towards that bar area because that's where they were when they got the food. And then they're accidentally going to press that bar again in another food pellet. And after about the third or the fourth time, the rat is going to associate the bar press with the food that they get. Does that make sense? At the beginning, but not as much now. There you go, Sarah. You do not have to reinforce the behavior a ton to keep it going. Now, continuous reinforcement is when you provide that dog treat every time the desired behavior occurs. Skinner found that yes, you can definitely cause a dog to acquire a behavior if you, or a rat to acquire a behavior if you reinforce that behavior every time. Brian Wilson, you know what brings up a good point, another subtlety I didn't mention. What he would do is he would take these pigeons or rats and he would keep them at 75% normal weight. So he would make sure these animals were hungry. Another very clever point, insightful point brought up by Ryan. In order for reinforcement to work, there has to be a need, a desire. And one of the difficult things with using behaviorism in the real world is you have to find out what it is people are hungry for. Brian, another great point. You are doing all the hits this morning, Brian. Brilliant, brilliant. Okay. And Melody Webb doesn't give treats but praise. You know what? Praise is a treat. It's an emotional treat that tastes yummy and warm. Okay, Melody? So yes, you do. You give emotional treats. Now, what Skinner found was you could also cause that behavior to be acquired if you reinforced a subset of the desired behaviors. You don't have to reinforce every lever press for it to happen. You can reinforce a subset. And he found that he could do this in two ways. He used two patterns and he found that both of them work. The first was what he called ratio consequences. And what he would do is he would reinforce every third bar press or every fourth bar press or every fifth bar press. So he would only reinforce a subset, a ratio, so the animal would have to press the bar multiple times before it got the reward. Now, he didn't tell the rat how many times. The rat would figure that out. But sometimes it would be 3, sometimes it would be 5. And here's the thing, he would make it so it occurred in a pattern, maybe every third bar press, or he would change it up so it was on average every third bar press. So we have what we might call a random ratio and a non-random ratio. Okay? And so, in a sense, you can reinforce just a subset of the desired behaviors. So if I gave you praise every third or fourth question you asked in the chat bar, and that's actually what I try to do, I try to make sure that I see Anna F. or Sarah in here every once in a while, and I try to give them praise. I reinforce that behavior. Not every time, but I do it a subset of the times. That's what's known as ratio reinforcement. And he found that that would cause a behavior to be acquired. And then he tried it even a different way. He said, you know what? I'm going to pick time frames and I'm going to reinforce the behavior once during the time frame. So here's where your time question, Brian, comes in. He might say, I'm going to reinforce that behavior every 10 seconds. The first time I see it, every 10-second interval. And so that rat could press the bar once in a 10-second interval and get a reinforcement. That animal could press the bar 100 times in that 10-second interval. They're still only getting one reinforcement. And he would do what's known as interval partial reinforcement, where he gave the positive consequences, not every time, but his unit of reinforcement was time and not number of bar presses. I hope that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. Good question. We'll talk about that in just a minute. In fact, I'm going to talk about that right now. Here's the deal. A behavior will be acquired. A behavior will be acquired every time it is conditioned. And you know what? I'm not sure if there's a limit to how many you can start, if it's 1 in 100 or 1 in 50 that doesn't work, Brian. I'm not sure. I'm not a behaviorist expert. But I do know this. You can cause any behavior to be acquired through conditioning. But what you're going to find out is that a behavior persists longer if it was conditioned through partial reinforcement. So this is what we would call continuous reinforcement. Okay. And see how this line goes down? Well, if you reinforce the behavior through partial reinforcement, you're still going to get this effect. But then when you quit reinforcing the behavior, what you're going to see is this is what we call partial reinforcement. All right? Do you see that? And this is what's known as the partial reinforcement effect. Does that make sense? Right? So what I'm trying to say is that he found that you could use two types of reinforcement to condition a behavior, but he discovered the insight that behavior that's conditioned with partial reinforcement actually lasts longer. So these were sort of the two big insights that I want you to take away from this particular class right here. Now, if you take a behaviorism class when you get to a four-year university, you're going to get into all these details, and we can talk about timing, we can talk about size, we can talk about motivation, we can talk about the shape of schedules of reinforcement. But this is sort of the basic meat and potatoes of what behaviorism is about. Now, here's the thing. I want you to think about in your day-to-day existence, what kinds of things do you find reinforcing? What kinds of things do you like? When you go to work, is there a cup of coffee for you? Does somebody always have a nice word for you? Is there somebody that when they come to see you, they always bring you a piece of candy? Or when you come to see them, they always offer you a piece of candy? Are there situations in your environment where you do things to get small rewards? Now, here's the deal. If you think about it, I give you extra credit if you do the discussion board and come to my weekly webinar. Now, here's the deal. I'm not a fool. I know why some of you come to the webinar, and you come to the webinar because you need and you want to earn a little bit of extra credit. Sure, Dr. Roddenberry is interesting, but I know you come for the credit. That's why I offer it, right? So, how is your environment set up to reinforce your behaviors? And are there ever situations where you don't do something because the situation is aversive? I avoid this person because we always get in a fight. This person smells bad. This person always says something mean to me. Is your behavior in your environment shaped by reinforcers and punishers, right? So, uh, yeah. All right. So if you would, go ahead and feel free to type an example of where your behavior is shaped every day by either reinforcers or punishers, right? Now, here's the deal I want you to understand a little bit as we discuss this. And as you write me your examples, you're going to tell me if you're going to tell me exactly what kinds of reinforcers and punishers they are. Here's the deal. In your world, there are two kinds of reinforcers and two kinds of punishers. Okay? There are two kinds of punishers and two kinds of reinforcers. There you go. Brian does good school because the A is reinforcing. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Okay, so here's the deal. If you look at this 2x2 chart over here, and I'm not sure I focused on the positive and the negative. They focused on the reinforcement and the punishment. Here's where students get things confused. And I promise you, I'm going to ask you about this on the homework. I'm going to ask you about this on the test. All right. I want you to know the difference between positive and negative. There are two ways to reinforce a behavior. You can reinforce a behavior by giving the learner something they like. You can also reinforce a learner by taking away something aversive, something they don't like. Okay? So in B.F. Skinner boxes, he used what's called positive reinforcement, a food pellet. Some of you in here have talked about giving pets or saying nice things to your animals. Those are positive reinforcements. You're adding something positive in. But you know what? Sometimes people do things because these behaviors lead to the removal of aversive consequences. How many of you have ever had a headache? Have you ever had a headache? If you've had a headache, you know what you do? You take aspirin and it makes that headache go away. That's what we would call a negative reinforcer. And that reinforces you to take aspirin when your head hurts. You know what? Every Sunday night, I take the garbage from around the back of my house out to the front of my house. You know why I do that? Because every Sunday night at 6 o'clock, my wife starts nagging me to take the garbage out. You need to take the garbage out, take the garbage out, take the garbage out. When are you going to take the garbage out? Are you going to take the garbage out? They're coming to get the garbage tomorrow. And just to shut her up, because I don't want to hear it, I go take the garbage out and she quits nagging me. In a sense, both of these situations, taking the aspirin and taking the garbage out, are ways to remove aversive consequences. And so, what you can do is you can set the animal up in an aversive state and then take the aversive state away when they engage in the appropriate behavior. Okay? Does that make sense? I hope everybody understands that. So sometimes you can reinforce the behavior two ways: by positive reinforcement, adding something they like to make them do the behavior more frequently, or you can remove something that is aversive to make them do the behavior more frequently. Notice that for reinforcement, the goal of reinforcement is to get the behavior to occur more frequently. Anything that makes a behavior occur more frequently in the future is a reinforcement. Okay? Now, we're going to differentiate that. You could almost say that all interaction is some form of positive or negative reinforcement. You know what? B.F. Skinner said that all interaction is some form of positive and negative reinforcement. He said cultural beliefs are positive or are reinforcing or punishing. He would say that you can think of evolution as nothing but a set of reinforcers and punishers. According to B.F. Skinner, you could use this idea of reinforcers and punishers to explain everything from genes to culture to how you learn to read and speak. And that's what I might call the radical behaviorist point of view. Yes, Brian, B.F. Skinner took it to its extreme. Now it came back to bite him because the cognitive showed how his theory was a little bit limited. Uh, but yes, you are definitely on to something. Everything is a reinforcer or a punisher. And this is why you'll notice that all areas of psychology use the tools of behaviorism. We all know that reinforcers and punishers work. We just know when they're supposed to be used. All right. Now, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the difference between punishment, positive and negative punishment. Now, remember, punishment, punishment is any consequence designed to decrease the frequency of a behavior. Now, you can do that by giving the learner something they don't like if they do a behavior, so they don't do it, or you can uh, take away something they like. Now, here's students always call this mess this one up. Positive punishment. Positive punishment is when you add something they don't like. Students always think that it has to be negative punishment, but positive punishment means you add something the learner doesn't like. If you mess up, I don't know about you, but if I messed up, my dad would spank me. He would give me some pain on the butt. He would add pain to my butt. That's what we would call positive punishment. he was adding an aversive state to my life to cause me to stop engaging in a particular behavior. That's one way to punish a kid. Most of you probably all were put on restriction once in your life, or maybe it was a thing of the 80s. But we used to get put on restriction or have our car keys taken away. Or some of you may have had your phone taken away. Taking a child's phone away, taking a kid's car keys away, is what we would call a negative punishment. That's because you take away something they like. And the goal of taking away your car keys or taking away your cell phone is to stop you from engaging in an undesirable behavior. Which reinforcement is stronger, negative or positive? Um, that's a great question. They can both be positive depending upon the state you set up. If the aversive state is aversive enough, the behavior will be acquired. So really, it's not so much a difference between positive and negative uh, uh, um, uh, um, reinforcement. But what does affect is the strength of the reinforcer and the timing. The more quickly the reinforcer follows the desirable behavior, the stronger the acquisition, the more efficient the acquisition will occur. So one of the things, if you've ever seen, and I'm going to show it to you tonight in webinar, if you've ever seen somebody professionally conditioning an animal, what they use is a clicker. Have any of you ever seen a clicker? They have them in the pet store. There'll be bowls of them if you go to your pet supply store. And what you do is you click the clicker as soon as the desired behavior occurs, and you follow it up within a half a second is what Skinner found. A half a second is causes the maximum learning to occur. Clicker and then the food. Clicker and then the food. Because a lot of times you can't get the food there quickly enough. But the clicker occurs in half a second every time and signals the dog that the food is coming. So you're giving them two reinforcers. It's kind of like when you give your dog a treat and you say something nice to them. You're adding two reinforcers. The clicker becomes a reinforcer. Okay? How come when someone is angry or grumpy, I have a hard time being around them? Absolutely, Cassette. Their behavior is punishing you. Their behavior is their attitude is punishing. So when you go around them, something you don't like is added. So they are adding positive punishment. That's a great example, Cassette. And think about how often you create an environment where you're handing out punishers accidentally when you need to be handing out reinforcers. And when you want people to do things for you, you have to learn how to use reinforcers instead of punishers. Ashley Nicole trained dogs for a bit, and was the biggest thing we were taught was making the behavior positive or negative. The reward or punishment come later. Absolutely, absolutely. All right. So here's the deal. I'm going to give you some examples really quickly. I have a young man. He is now through high school, so this example's a little bit old, but I have my younger son is a tough one, boy. He needed some training and some conditioning. So Zachary, my Z man. So what I used were some behavioral techniques to help train Z to engage in good behaviors and avoid bad behaviors. So here's the deal. I would give Z $20 every time he makes an A on his report card. Am I using a punisher, a reinforcer, and is it a positive or negative punisher or reinforcer? Can somebody analyze that outcome, that consequence? What am I doing if I give Zachary 20 bucks every time he makes an A? What am I doing, folks? Quickly, 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 quickly. I'm waiting for an answer in the chat bar here because I know somebody's going to know it. Reinforcer, doggone it, I'm going to require you to be a little more specific, Imani. What type of reinforcer? There you go. Sam is right. It's a positive reinforcer. I am adding something he likes to his wallet every time he does what I want. The goal here is that he'll make lots of A's, right? Now, Zachary made a D on his report card, so I made him paint the garage, the inside of the garage. He didn't like it at all. What was I doing there? If I made Z paint the garage because he made a D on his report card, what am I doing there? And be specific. You can't just say punishment or reinforcement. You have to give me a positive or a negative. Do, 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 do. It's a positive punisher. Absolutely, Brian Wilson. Absolutely, Imani. Fantastic. Great job. Great job. Okay. Now, here's the deal. I typically have a curfew of 11 o'clock on weeknights and 12 o'clock on weekends. My kid is 17. Y'all may think that's a little extravagant. You may think that's too extreme. But he has to be in by 11 o'clock Monday through Thursday. He has to be in at 12 o'clock on Friday night and Saturday night. But you know what? He made straight A's last semester. So you know what I said? For the next month, I'm going to move your restriction back 1 hour. You can come home at night at midnight, Monday through Thursday, and 1 o'clock on the weekends. I removed his curfew. What am I doing there? What am I doing there, folks? And remember, got to be specific. What do you have to be specific? Do, 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 do. All right, and while you're answering that, I'll go to number 4. That is a negative reinforcement. Yes, absolutely. And why is it a negative reinforcement? What am I doing that makes it? Nope, it's not a positive reinforcement, Sandra. It's negative. And why is it negative and not positive? I'm going to let somebody in the chat bar explain that to you while I go on. Now, here's the deal. I took away Zach's car because he made a D on his report card, and I wouldn't let him drive his car that he loved so much for a month. What is that? A curfew is not light. And so the time restriction, so the idea is the time restriction is an aversive consequences, and we removed it. Very good. I see several people helping out in the chat bar. And then exactly. And then negative punishment. So I took away something he liked because he did a behavior I didn't like, right? Now, here's the real point that I want you to take from this class. If you want to get something from this psychology class to help you in the real world, I want you to begin to understand the world of consequences that you live in that shapes your behavior. What kinds of things reinforce your behaviors? What kinds of things punish the behaviors that you can avoid, right? How can you set up situations where your children's the behavior you want is reinforced and where the behavior you don't want is not reinforced? You'd be surprised. Some parents actually intentionally or unintentionally condition negative behaviors in their children, and sometimes we punish behaviors, positive behaviors in children. That's going to be the focus of tonight's webinar. I hope to give you some tips to help you be a better parent. Okay. Now, here's the deal. Let's talk about one thing, one last point, and it's the idea of shaping. Now, so far we've been talking about really simple behaviors, pressing a bar. He also used pigeons, and he would make B.F. Skinner used pigeons, and he would make the pigeons peck a circle. And so these were all fairly simple behaviors. But you can actually condition very, very complex behaviors if you know the technique of shaping. Have any of you ever been to the circus and seen circus animals do really insane complex tricks? Have you ever watched a movie and seen a dog or a horse or another animal in a movie do a really cool, crazy behavior, right? You can actually condition complex behaviors using the concept of shaping, right? And by the way, success of shaping is what led B.F. Skinner to really believe that everything was a product of conditioning. And B.F. Skinner and John Watson saw no difference between an animal learning a trick and a human being learning how to read or tie their shoes or do well in school. All right. Now, here's the problem. If you want a complex behavior, to train a complex behavior, you have to understand that animals don't necessarily engage in a complex behavior randomly. All right. If you remember when I talked about operant conditioning, I said behavior that starts out random becomes intentional because of consequences. Animals don't typically do complex behaviors. A child doesn't wake up and ride a bicycle randomly. You have to condition the behaviors along the way. And so what you do is you use this thing called successive approximations. You find behaviors that are on the road to the behavior you want to see and condition those behaviors one by one, right? So, I want to teach my dog to surf. You know what? A dog is not going to jump on a surfboard and ride it randomly the first time. It's just not going to happen. So, what you have to do is you have to condition increments of that behavior so the dog figures out what you want. So, the first thing you would do is you would take the dog out and you would get them in the water. And when you got them in the water, you would reinforce them for liking to coming in the water. And then after they did that, you would then take them and put them up on the surfboard. You would help them get on the surfboard, and if they stayed there, that would be the random behavior. You'd give them a treat, and that's what we would call a successive approximation. After a while, the animal would jump up on the surfboard and stand there automatically. They would know that, and they would do that for the treat. After you got them to do that, you would then push the surfboard with them on it. And if they didn't jump off, you would reinforce that behavior. And then what you would do is you would move up a set of behaviors incrementally to where that dog was doing something that looked very, very complex. Tonight in class, I'm actually going to show you a 5-minute video of a lady who trains her dog to come inside the house and turn on the lights for her. So she actually trains this dog to turn on the lights when they walk in the house. The dog runs over, jumps up on the wall, and turns the switch up. A dog would never do this randomly, but what she does is she uses successive approximations to work towards the desired complex behavior. So you start with the behavior the learner might do, you reinforce that behavior. After they learn that behavior, you quit reinforcing that behavior and you force them to do another behavior which is a little farther along. And then once they do that next behavior, you reinforce that behavior. And then you expect a behavior that's a little closer. And so you incrementally move towards the desirable complex behavior. And I'm going to suggest to you that you can teach children how to play sports. You can teach children complex behavioral activities around the house, how to do chores, how to be good citizens. You can teach this through the process of shaping and successive approximations. Okay? Are you take okay? Rejection sensitivity dysphoria is common with ADHD and other mental issues. Is this kind of misfiring of how the brain perceives and registers behavior conditioning? Yes. Wow. Great point, Nicole. Holy cow. Tori, did you see this amazing question? Yes. In a sense, you're saying that this learner is hypersensitive to punishments, is exactly what that is. And this would be an interaction between biology and environment. So some kids are more driven by reinforcers than punishers. Some kids are more sensitive to reinforcers and punishers than others. And a kid with RSD would be hypersensitive to punishers. But you know what? I'm going to argue to you that most human beings will try to avoid aversive states. If you really want to train children effectively, you need to make sure you can you create a world of reinforcers rather than punishers. And I'm not saying that to be a liberal, soft psychology professor, but organisms respond better to reinforcers than they do to punishers. Reinforcers tell you what to do, and human beings are active creatures. They want to know what to do and not what not to do, right? That's a brilliant question. Tori, this class is super smart. It's amazing what you'll hear in this class on a day-to-day behavior. So tonight we're going to talk about applied behavior analysis, shaping, and how you might shape pro-social behaviors in your children. I hope everybody comes to webinar tonight at 7 p.m. Now, here's the thing. This classical conditioning works so well. Operant conditioning works so well. Shaping can be used to create such complex behaviors in animals. And we all use reinforcers automatically to train animals and children in our households. This led a fellow named B.F. Skinner to get pretty doggone arrogant about the power of the behaviorist principles. And he said, you know what, we ought to throw everything away and just see the world as being nothing but a set of punishers and reinforcers. Evolution punishes when you change, you have a mutation, punishes some mutations, rewards some other mutations. Your survival, getting to eat, is reinforced by some behaviors are reinforced with food and survival, other behaviors are reinforced with death or punished by death. And so he said you can think about the whole world, just basically turn the world into ones and zeros, punishers and reinforcers. And he actually suggested that there is no such thing as free will. Your favorite color is blue? Oh no, my friend, you wore a blue shirt one time and somebody you like patted you on the head. Your favorite food is tacos. You know what? You ate tacos one time and your parent gave you a piece of candy afterward for eating tacos. You think you have free will? No, you don't, my friend. You are nothing but a product of your reinforcers and punishers. He actually wrote this book right here, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. It's more of a philosophical treatise about the value of behaviorism, but he says we need to move beyond the concepts of freedom and dignity and just understand that all behavior is conditioned. And look at this quote by him. I did not direct my life. I didn't design it. I never made decisions. Things came up and made these decisions for me. That's what life is. And look at this quote right below me. In the traditional view, a person is free. He's autonomous in the sense that his behavior is uncaused. Um, he said that view, together with its associated practices, must be re examined when a scientific analysis reveals controlling relations between behavior and environment. Folks, he didn't believe in free will. Did you decide to come here this morning? Do you like me or is my behavior reinforcing? Where does you stop and where does the environment begin? How much in control of your actions are you? B.F. Skinner said you are not in control of any of your actions. So if you use his tools, what he would suggest is that anytime somebody breaks the law, society is the one that made the mistake. Anytime you use drugs, it's because somehow the environment shaped that particular behavior. And so he argued we should create a technology of behavior so that we could get rid of poverty and crime and everything. And this belief might be known as radical behaviorism. Pretty amazing, huh? Sort of weird. Now, here's the thing when you take a strong stand like this, I mean, this is pretty ballsy. He went out there and just laid it out there and said, dude, I think that not only is my way the most important way, but my way is the only way. Why doesn't it take a willing participant? That's another great question, Brian. What the social cognition people like Albert Bandura and Albert Ellis are going to show us when we get to chapter 11 is they are going to show us that you have to factor the organism in as an agent of choice. That's a great. I can choose what environment I go into to get my reinforcers or punishers, right? So you have to factor in agency. And we're going to talk about that in chapter 11. But you know what? That brings up a great point. Here's the deal when you make a strong stand like B.F. Skinner does, the critics come out of the woodwork. And so, after making these strong, incredibly grand statements, behaviorism set itself up as not the best way to do psychology, but the only way to do psychology. And over the course of the and behaviorism was at its power in 1920. And over the next 30 years, scientists in the field of psychology began to provide evidence that showed that we have to think about behavior and organisms as being more than just environmental consequences. Okay, now there are several examples of this, and I don't think I'm going to have time to go over all of them really well, but here's the deal. Uh, a fellow named Noam Chomsky, we talked about him in webinar, and somebody pointed him out that he's a big political writer now. But Noam Chomsky, before he was a communist and a political writer, was a hell of a linguist. And his dissertation, his PhD dissertation, Verbal Syntactic Structures, which became the book Syntactic Structures, made him an international star. And he demonstrated in his book that there is no way language can be learned through just behaviorism. He showed it's far too complex and far too cognitive for it to be nothing but a product of the environment. And in this book, he created the concept of what he called the language acquisition device, this innate biological predisposition that you have to learn language. He showed it's not just environment, but there's biology in it. Okay, and other research showed that this concept called instinctive drift. You can teach an animal a behavior, but if that behavior is similar to an instinctual behavior that they use, after a while, their learned behavior will shift away and drift away from the behavior you conditioned it back to the instinctual behavior. So instincts override the environmental consequences. And then this thing called the Garcia effect, and this would take 10 minutes to describe itself, but he basically showed that some things are more easily conditioned than some associations are easier to condition than other associations. So he showed that when you use nausea, it's easier for it to be conditioned to things you can taste than things you can see. And I won't even ask you about the Garcia effect on the test. I should really spend 20 minutes talking about that. Behaviorism's got a lot of stuff I could talk about. But in a sense, scientists showed that biology matter. There's an automatic circuit built into your brain that's stronger than the environment, and animals that learned behaviors are not as powerful as instinctual or inborn behaviors. Now, other psychologists showed that you have to factor in the agency of the mind, Brian. The behaviorists thought that when you think, it doesn't matter. You may think you're doing something, but basically you're explaining to yourself what happened after the fact. You've already been conditioned by the environment. And when you think you're doing something, it's because you're explaining to yourself what you've already done. So behaviorists didn't think the mind was very important. But this fellow, goodness, I forget his name, Edward Tolman, demonstrated insight learning. He demonstrated that organisms learn even if they're not being reinforced. In a behaviorist world, you only learn something if that behavior is reinforced. Edward Tolman showed through his puzzle boxes that rats learn even if they're not being reinforced. Oh, excuse me, that's cognitive maps and latent learning. Now, insight learning. Wolfgang Kohler, a German scientist, showed that monkeys would sometimes just get a brilliant idea. He would show them a multi-part problem, and he found that these monkeys wouldn't just learn the problem incrementally. They would put the problem together and demonstrate this cognitive quality we call insight, the aha moment, right? Now, another fellow, Albert Bandura, I know you folks have all heard of the Bobo, maybe you've heard of the Bobo doll study. I'm going to talk about it in chapter 13. But what Albert Bandura showed was that children will behave violently if they see a model behave violently. Now, they're not being reinforced. The model is being reinforced maybe, but the kid's not being reinforced. And yet children still learn that behavior without reinforcement. And then this crazy thing called the computer was invented, which was a mechanical brain, which could think on its own. We're going to talk about that next week. And so all four of these insights demonstrated that we can't discount the mind. right? Now, the fact that psychologists showed that biology matters, the fact that cognitive psychologists showed that the mind matters, really caused B.F. Skinner and behaviorism to fall from grace because B.F. Skinner put it out there as the only way to do science. And so, what we now know, folks, is it's not either nature or nurture, but it's a combination of both. We know that it's the environment, but human beings also have agency. So I want you to think of behaviorism as a set of tools that can show you how environments can be created to make desirable behaviors more likely to occur. Okay, there you go, Brian. Exactly. And if you show somebody learns something by watching another person, that flies in the face of a model that says you can only learn through consequences, right? So we have to say that B.F. Skinner's beliefs weren't quite as complete as he wanted them to be. All right, I have run over by 2 minutes. Has everybody had a good time today? Do you feel like you learned something about training animals today? If you did, go ahead and type in the chat bar and tell me that you learned something today. Remember, we've got webinar tonight at 7 p.m. in Microsoft Teams. If you can't make it to webinar, don't forget to complete the discussion board, which is due tonight by 11:59. Wow, I'm glad you came. Brian, you had some great questions. Cassette, Nicole, your point about RSD was brilliant. You folks had some really great comments today in the chat bar. Thanks for making me look good in front of Tori. Tori, I don't know if you're still here. You probably had to bounce out, but I wanted to just thank Tori for stopping in today. It was great having her. All right, folks, I will see. Oh, Tori is still here. Folks, I will see you tonight at 7 o'clock. Until then, have a great day. And somebody wanted to talk to me after class. If you would just send me a text. Who is that wanted to talk to me? Send me a message in the chat bar if you still want to talk, and we'll contact after class. For the rest of you, take care and have a great day. See you tomorrow.